Living in an HOA community was supposed to mean rules, order, and respect for property. At least, that's what the HOA claimed when I first bought my house. But in reality, it just meant dealing with entitled neighbors who thought they owned the entire block. At first, I didn't have any major issues. My home was on a spacious corner lot with a beautifully maintained lawn, one that I took great pride in. I spent weekends trimming the hedges, making sure the grass was lush and green, and keeping everything looking perfect. But then came my new neighbor, Brad. Brad and his family moved in 6 months ago, and right from the start, it was clear that Brad had no respect for boundaries. He was the kind of guy who always had excuses, the kind who never followed HOA rules unless they directly benefited him, the kind who thought he was above everyone else. And the worst part, he had too many cars. Brad's parking problem becomes my problem. Brad's house had a 2-car garage and a driveway big enough for 3 cars. But for some reason, he and his wife owned 5 vehicles. His garage was always packed with junk, so he left 2 cars in the driveway. That meant his extra cars spilled over into the street. But instead of following the HOA's street parking rules, Brad chose an easier solution. He started parking on my lawn. At first, I thought it was a one-time thing. One evening, I came home and saw his giant black SUV sitting on my grass. I assumed it was a mistake, so I walked over and knocked on his door. Brad answered, looking as smug as ever. I kept it polite. "Hey, Brad, I think one of your cars accidentally ended up on my lawn." Brad chuckled. "Oh yeah, man. My driveway's full and the street's packed. Hope you don't mind. I'll move it later." I frowned. "Yeah, I do mind. It's my lawn." Brad shrugged like it wasn't a big deal. "It's just grass, bro. I'll move it in the morning." I had to bite my tongue to stop myself from snapping at him. Instead, I said, "Move it now." Brad rolled his eyes, but eventually he did. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Brad's disrespect escalates, and the HOA does nothing. A few days later, I woke up to find 2 of Brad's cars parked on my lawn. Not just 1, 2. Both of them were half on my grass, half on the sidewalk, completely ruining my perfectly maintained lawn. I was furious. I stormed over to his house and banged on his door. Brad answered, looking half asleep and annoyed. "What now?" I gestured toward my lawn. "Your cars. Move them." "No." Brad yawned and stretched. "Dude, chill. Doesn't care." That stopped me. "Deal? What?" Brad smirked. "Yeah, I asked them about street parking, and they said they don't enforce rules on temporary parking arrangements." I stared at him, disbelief boiling into rage. "You think my lawn is a parking lot?" Brad laughed. "It's just a patch of grass, man. What's the big deal?" I clenched my fists. "Move the cars." Brad shrugged. "I'll get to it later." That's when I knew. Talking wasn't going to fix this. Brad thinks he won, but I'm about to teach him a lesson. I went back inside, seething. Brad thought he could walk all over me. He thought that just because the HOA wouldn't enforce their rules, he could do whatever he wanted. He thought I would just roll over and accept it. He was wrong. I started looking up city parking laws and property rights. And that's when I found it the perfect solution. If a car is left on private property without permission, the property owner has the right to have it towed. No warnings required. No HOA involvement necessary. And just to make sure, I called a local towing company and confirmed it. So if someone parks on my lawn, I can have it towed? The guy on the phone chuckled. "Oh, absolutely. If it's on your property, you can tow it at the owner's expense." I grinned. Perfect. The next morning, I saw Brad's car parked on my lawn again. And this time, I made the call. The tow truck arrives, and Brad loses his mind. I sat on my porch, sipping my coffee, as a big, beautiful tow truck pulled up in front of my house. The driver stepped out, nodded at me, and got to work. Brad's black SUV was lifted off my lawn like it weighed nothing. And right as the truck started pulling away, Brad came running out of his house, screaming like a lunatic. "What the hell? That's my car. I casually took another sip of my coffee. Not anymore. Brad sprinted toward the tow truck, waving his arms. Stop. You can't do this. The tow truck driver didn't even look at him. Brad turned to me, fuming. Dude, what did you do? I smiled. I had it towed. Brad's face turned purple. You can't tow my car. I stood up and stretched. Actually, I can. You parked it on my property without permission. That's called trespassing. Brad looked like his brain short-circuited. But I was going to move it. I shrugged. Too late. You can pick it up from Impound. Brad turned back to the tow truck just in time to see his SUV disappearing down the road. And then he did the most Brad thing possible. He called the cops. I stood there, watching Brad pace back and forth on his driveway, absolutely fuming as he dialed 911. Yes, I want to report a theft. Someone just stole my car. I smirked. Oh, this was going to be good. Brad kept rambling to the dispatcher, conveniently leaving out the part where he parked on my property. He turned to me, rage in his eyes. You're going to jail for this. I chuckled. Good luck with that. About 15 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up. The officer, a middle-aged guy who looked like he had already dealt with too many Karens and Brads for one lifetime, stepped out and walked up to Brad. You reported a stolen vehicle? Brad nodded aggressively. Yes. This guy stole my SUV. The officer looked at me, then at my lawn, then back at Brad. Where was the car when it was stolen? Brad crossed his arms. Right there. He pointed at my lawn. The officer blinked. Then he turned to me. Sir, was this car parked on your property? I nodded. Yes, officer. Without my permission. Brad snapped. IT was temporary. The officer rubbed his temples. So let me get this straight. You parked your car on his private property, and he had it towed? Brad hesitated. Well, yeah, but... The officer sighed. Sir, that's not theft. That's a legal tow. Brad's jaw dropped. What? The officer turned to me. Do you have proof that this is your property? I pulled out my property deed and boundary map, which I had already prepared because, let's be real, I knew Brad was going to try something stupid. The officer looked it over and nodded. Yeah, this is clearly private property. Sir, you were within your rights to have the vehicle towed. Brad lost his mind. That's not fair. I need that car. The officer sighed deeply, clearly running out of patience. Sir, your car is at the impound lot. You'll have to pay the release fee. Brad's face turned red. How much is it? The officer shrugged. Usually a couple $100 plus daily storage fees. Brad looked like he was going to explode. He turned to me, teeth clenched. You owe me that money. I laughed. Loudly. I don't owe you anything. You owe yourself for being an idiot. The officer held up a hand. Sir, I suggest you calm down. Your car wasn't stolen. It was lawfully removed. Brad took a deep breath. Then, like the absolute moron he was, he made things even worse for himself. He turned to the officer and said, Well, I'm just going to park there again. The officer's expression darkened. Sir, that would be trespassing. And if you do it again, the homeowner has the right to press charges. Brad froze. I grinned. You hear that, Brad? Next time, it won't just be a tow truck. It'll be the cops. Brad gritted his teeth. Then, without another word, he stomped back inside his house and slammed the door. The officer shook his head. Let us know if he bothers you again. I smiled. Oh, I will. But the thing is, I knew Brad wasn't done yet, because the very next morning, his car was back on my lawn. Brad decides to test me, and I tow his car again. I woke up, stretched, looked outside, and there it was. Brad's brand new pickup truck sitting on my lawn like he was taunting me. I swear, it was like he was saying, What are you going to do about it now? I smiled, because I already knew exactly what I was going to do. I called the tow company. Again. Hey, it's me again. Yeah, same house. Different car. 15 minutes later, the tow truck pulled up. The The driver laughed. Didn't we just tow his cars yesterday? I grinned. Yep. And now we're towing another one. The tow truck lifted Brad's truck onto the flatbed. And just like last time, Brad came running out of his house, screaming, "Not again. Stop. You can't do this." I waved. "Morning, Brad. Looks like you're down another vehicle." Brad stumbled forward, hands on his head. "How? Why?" I shrugged. "Because you're an idiot." The tow truck drove off, taking Brad's truck with it. Brad collapsed onto his knees, looking like a man who had just lost everything. And I went back inside and made myself another cup of coffee. Because this time, Brad had really screwed himself over. Not only was his truck gone, but the HOA was finally getting involved. I had barely finished my coffee when I heard another knock at my door. I sighed, already knowing who it was. Sure enough, when I opened it, there stood the HOA president, Linda, along with 2 board members. Linda was a classic HOA type, the kind of person who acted like she was running a royal kingdom instead of a suburban neighborhood. She adjusted her clipboard and gave me a fake smile. "Mr. My last name, we need to talk." I crossed my arms. "About what?" Linda's smile dropped instantly. "We've had a complaint." I raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, Brad." Linda sighed like she was exhausted. "Yes, and we're here to inform you that towing a fellow homeowner's vehicle without HOA approval is a violation of community rules." I burst out laughing. "I'm sorry, what?" Linda's eyes narrowed. "It's a serious matter. We cannot allow neighbors to engage in unnecessary conflicts. We expect you to cease this behavior immediately." I smiled. Because this was my favorite part. I stepped back into my house, grabbed a folder from my kitchen table, and held it up. "You see this? This is my property deed." Linda blinked. "Yes?" And I flipped to the important page. "This document proves that my property was never part of the HOA." Linda's face twitched. One of the board members coughed. "Wait, what?" I grinned. "You heard me. My house was never part of the HOA. The previous owner opted out when this neighborhood was first established. That means your rules." I pointed at Linda. "Don't apply to me." Linda stiffened. "That can't be right. All homes in this neighborhood fall under HOA jurisdiction." I pulled out the second document. "Wrong again. Here's a signed legal statement from my realtor confirming that my property is HOA-free." Linda's face went pale. One of the board members leaned over to glance at the paper. His eyes widened. Linda? He's right." Linda looked like she had just swallowed a lemon. But I wasn't done yet. I held up one more paper. "And just for fun, here's the police report from yesterday confirming that Brad was trespassing on private property. And here's the city ordinance that states I have every right to tow any unauthorized vehicle from my land." Linda gritted her teeth. "Mr. My last name, we are trying to maintain peace in this community. Surely you understand that excessive towing will only create hostility." I smirked. "No, what I understand is that the HOA didn't care when Brad was trespassing on my lawn. But now that I'm taking action, suddenly it's a problem." Linda glared at me. I stepped closer. "You want to talk about hostility? How about the hostility of some entitled HOA clown thinking he can park on my property whenever he wants? Or the hostility of you trying to enforce rules on someone who isn't even part of the HOA?" Linda opened her mouth, then closed it. Because she knew. She had nothing. After a long, awkward pause, she cleared her throat. "We will review this further." I nodded. "You do that. And while you're at it, review your HOA's legal boundaries, because if I see one more of your board members at my door trying to enforce fake rules on me, I will file harassment charges." Linda's eyes flashed with anger, but she knew she was defeated. She turned on her heel. "Have a nice day, Mr. My last name." I grinned. "Oh, I will." And with that, the HOA walked away, humiliated. But Brad? Brad was about to learn the biggest lesson of all. Brad gets the ultimate punishment, and it's beautiful. 2 days later, I got a text from my neighbor Steve. It was a photo of Brad's house. And in his driveway, a big yellow boot was clamped onto his last remaining car. I burst out laughing. You see, after getting 2 of his cars towed, Brad still owed money to the impound lot. But instead of paying the fees, he decided to ignore them. And the city, well, they didn't ignore him. Since Brad had multiple unpaid citations, the city placed a boot on his last vehicle. He was officially out of cars. And the best part, Steve told me that Brad had a complete meltdown. He ran outside, screaming at the parking enforcement officer. But the officer just handed him a ticket and walked away. Brad was screwed. And the cherry on top, a few weeks later, Brad sold his house. He moved out of the neighborhood, humiliated and broke. And me? I finally got my peaceful lawn back. No more cars. No more drama. No more Brad. Brad thought my lawn was his parking lot. Now his cars are gone. He called the cops on me. They told him to pay up. The HOA tried to interfere. I shut them down hard. Brad lost everything, and I got the last laugh. Moral of the story: don't park where you don't belong.